They told me the cottage had a mold problem, said it wasn't safe to visit. I believed them for 4 years. My name is Margaret Wellett. I'm 64 years old, a retired French immersion teacher from Thunder Bay, Ontario. My days had settled into a quiet rhythm, morning walks along the lake shore, tending my herb garden, and the occasional video call with friends from the school where I'd spent 31 years of my life. I thought the biggest chapters of my story were already written. I was wrong. My daughter, Renee, was an environmental toxicologist at a university in Halifax. Brilliant, fiercely principled, the kind of woman who wrote letters to city councils and actually expected replies. She married Thomas Beausoleil when she was 32, a quiet, thoughtful man who worked in community health outreach for Indigenous communities across Cape Breton Island. Together, they bought an old property on the Cabot Trail, a wide windowed place that overlooked the Gulf of St. Lawrence. Every time I asked to visit, Renee would laugh softly and say, "Not yet, Maman. The mold remediation is taking forever. You'd be miserable." So I waited. I sent casseroles frozen in courier boxes. I sent cards for every holiday. I waited. Then one Tuesday in March, I received a phone call from a woman named Patricia Duval, Renee's lawyer. Her voice had the careful gentleness people use when they already know they're about to change everything. She told me there had been a car accident on the Trans-Canada, a transport truck that crossed the center line on an icy stretch near Antigonish. Renee and Thomas were gone. I remember sitting down on the kitchen floor without deciding to, the way grief bypasses the mind entirely and goes straight to the legs. I remember the sound of the refrigerator humming, indifferent and mechanical, while my entire world reorganized itself around an absence. 3 days later, Patricia called again and asked to meet. Her office in downtown Thunder Bay smelled of paper and weak coffee. She handed me a sealed envelope, written in Renee's handwriting, and told me the Cape Breton property had been left to me in its entirety. She also passed me a small brass key on a plain ring with a piece of masking tape on it. Renee had written on the tape, in her careful block letters, "Storage room. You'll understand when you get there." I stared at the key for a long moment. "She never let me visit," I said, not quite to Patricia and not quite to myself. Patricia nodded slowly. "She said you would come when the time was right." I drove the question home with me that night. "You'll understand when you get there." Those words kept circling through my mind the way a song gets stuck, shapeless and persistent. What was there to understand? That the mold had been worse than she let on? That she'd been embarrassed by the state of the place? I had raised her in a 3-bedroom bungalow with a cracked bathroom tile for 9 years before I had the money to fix it. She knew I didn't care about imperfection. The key sat on my kitchen counter for 11 days before I booked a flight to Sydney. The drive from the Sydney airport to the Cabot Trail took nearly 2 hours. I had rented a small sedan, and the man at the counter had kindly printed me a paper map when I told him my phone GPS made me nervous on unfamiliar roads. April in Cape Breton still carries winter in its bones. The trees along the highway were only beginning to think about budding, the sky low and the color of old pewter. I drove through the English town ferry crossing and up into the highlands, watching the Gulf appear and disappear between the hills like a rumor. I had imagined the cottage as a small, weathered thing. What I found at the end of a long gravel lane was something else entirely. A converted 2-story property with large north-facing windows, a generator shed around the side, and a satellite dish nearly hidden behind a stand of spruce trees. No construction equipment, no tarps, no evidence of any remediation work, recent or otherwise. The exterior was clean and maintained. Someone had even stacked new firewood against the south wall. The front door opened with the key Patricia had given me. Inside, the air was cool and carried something I recognized immediately and couldn't quite place the faint, chemical clarity of a laboratory. Not unpleasant, specific. I had smelled it once before, years ago, when my school board organized a visit to the water testing facility outside Thunder Bay. The main floor was sparse but functional, a kitchen with institutional shelving, a living area with a folding table and mismatched chairs. No photographs, no decorative touches, nothing that said home. I walked down a short hallway and opened a door on the left. The room held 4 large stainless steel refrigeration units humming steadily, shelves of sealed sample containers labeled in Renee's handwriting, a centrifuge, a set of water filtration columns, and a wall-mounted whiteboard covered in chemical notation I didn't understand. On the small desk in the corner were stacks of binders, each spine marked with the name of a community: Wacoba, Eskasoni, Membertou, Wagmatcook, Millbrook. I stood in the doorway for a long time. This was not a vacation property. This was not a home with a mold problem. I whispered into the quiet room. "Renee, what were you doing here?" The spruce trees moved against the window. The refrigeration units hummed on. I slept badly that night on the folding couch I found in an upstairs room, wrapped in a blanket from my suitcase, listening to the wind come off the water. By morning, I had decided I wasn't leaving until I understood what I was looking at. I returned to the lab room with my reading glasses and a notebook. The binders were organized by community and by year, going back 6 years. Inside each one were water sampling records, lab analysis sheets, and something that stopped me on the 3rd page of the first binder, a comparison chart showing contaminant levels in the municipal water supplies for 5 Cape Breton Mi'kmaq communities versus the provincial safety thresholds. In every case, across every year, the recorded levels exceeded the threshold significantly: lead, arsenic, volatile organic compounds from an industrial site 20 kilometers upstream that had been decommissioned officially 11 years ago. The provincial records in the adjacent column showed different numbers entirely. I sat back in the chair and read that again. Renee's numbers, the government's numbers, side by side, completely different. My hands were unsteady as I turned the pages. There were letters, correspondence between Thomas and community health workers describing clusters of illness, children with neurological symptoms, adults with unexplained kidney disease, elders who had been told repeatedly by regional health authorities that their water tested clean. There were also letters from a company called Novaterre Environmental Solutions. The tone of them shifted across the years, from politely dismissive to formally threatening. The last one was dated 4 months before the accident. It read, in part, that continued unauthorized testing and distribution of non-certified analysis reports constituted interference with a provincially regulated remediation process and could result in legal action. I found the brass key's second purpose in the storage room off the kitchen, a fireproof lockbox. Inside, it was a USB drive, a copy of a formal research report stamped draft not for distribution, and a handwritten letter addressed to me. "Maman," it began. "If you are reading this, something has happened and we couldn't finish what we started. I need you to know first that keeping you away from this place was never about you. It was about keeping you safe. The people who want this information buried are not the kind who send polite emails. Thomas and I have spent 4 years documenting what Novaterre and the Provincial Environmental Ministry have been covering up. 5 communities, hundreds of people sick, children, Maman, the same children Thomas has been visiting every month for his outreach work. We are close to having enough to go to a federal environmental tribunal. We have everything on the drive. If we're gone, find Dr. Sylvie Chartrand at Cape Breton University. She knows. She's been waiting for the right moment. Tell her the moment has come. Whatever you do, don't let them make this disappear." Je t'aime à n'en plus finir, René. I put the letter down on the desk, and I did not move for a very long time. Outside, the Gulf of St. Lawrence caught the afternoon light and threw it back in pieces. I had spent 4 years being gently turned away at a distance. 4 years of frozen casseroles and unanswered questions, and the low, persistent ache of feeling shut out of my daughter's life. I had blamed myself quietly, the way mothers do, wondered if I was too much, or not enough, or simply inconvenient to the life she was building. She had been protecting me. All of it, the mold excuse, the deflections, the shortened phone calls, had been a wall she built around me so that whatever was coming for her wouldn't come for me, too. I sat in that room and let that settle into my bones. That night, I heard gravel crunching under tires outside. I turned off the desk lamp and pressed myself against the wall beside the window. Headlights swept across the ceiling, paused, then cut out. I heard a car door close quietly, too quietly, the way people close doors when they don't want to be heard. Then a second door. I stood absolutely still in the dark room, heart loud in my ears, trying to remember if I had locked the front door. A knock came, firm but unhurried. I stayed where I was. Another knock. Then a woman's voice, low, "Mrs. Ouellet, my name is Sylvie Chartrand. I was a colleague of your daughter. I saw the light on from the road. Please, it's important that we speak." I let out the breath I hadn't known I was holding. I made my way to the front door and opened it. She was in her 50s, compact and serious, wearing a university jacket over a wool sweater. Behind her stood a younger man, maybe late 20s, carrying a laptop bag over one shoulder. He introduced himself as Daniel Auger, a graduate student in environmental law. "We didn't expect anyone to be here yet," Sylvie said, scanning my face. "Thomas always said that if anything happened, you might eventually come. He was counting on it." I stepped back to let them inside. "Tell me what's going on." "All of it." Sylvie set her bag on the folding table and unzipped it with the efficiency of someone who had rehearsed this moment. Your daughter and Thomas were building a federal case against Novaterra and against 3 senior officials in the Provincial Ministry of Environment. The contamination in those 5 communities isn't accidental and it isn't historic. It is ongoing. The decommissioned site upstream the Prevost chemical facility was never fully remediated. Novaterra was contracted to do the cleanup 12 years ago. They submitted falsified results. The ministry signed off on them. And every year since, the water flowing into those communities has been carrying the same compounds at the same levels. Daniel opened his laptop and turned it toward me. Charts, mapping data, satellite images of the Prevost site with what appeared to be active drainage infrastructure. Renee's lab records here match what we've been building on the university side, he said quietly. Together, it's enough. More than enough. I looked at the whiteboard covered in Renee's chemical notation. I looked at the binder spines, Wacoba, Eskasoni, Membertou, Wagmitcook, Millbrook. How many people? I asked. Sylvie paused. Our current health correlation data suggests several hundred affected individuals across the 5 communities. The neurological caseload in children under 12 is particularly significant. She said it carefully, clinically, but her jaw was tight. We've been trying to reach a federal environmental advocate for 2 years. The provincial channels are compromised. We need someone outside this region to take the file. And my daughter knew all of this. Your daughter, Sylvie said, was the most rigorous scientist I have worked with in 20 years. She knew exactly what she had. She was waiting until the dataset was complete enough to be bulletproof, because she knew that if they went public with anything less, Novaterra's legal team would dismantle it piece by piece. She hesitated. She was very close. After Sylvie and Daniel left that night, leaving me copies of the key files and a secure contact number, I sat at Renee's desk until nearly 2 a.m. I am not a scientist. I am a retired French teacher who can conjugate 47 irregular verbs from memory, and who spent 3 decades teaching 12-year-olds the difference between savoir and connaître. I have no business being in the middle of an environmental contamination case. But Renee had left the letter to me, not to Sylvie, who was more equipped, not to Daniel, who was younger and had more time. To me, I think she knew something about grief that I was only beginning to understand, that it either hollows you out or it makes you harder to frighten. She was betting on the second. 2 mornings later, I found a note tucked under the wiper blade of my rental car. It said, "The investigation into the accident is not closed. Go home while you still have one to go to." I brought the note inside and photographed it. That afternoon, my phone rang from a number I didn't recognize. A man's voice, pleasant on the surface, the way certain types of professionalism are pleasant on the surface. He introduced himself as a communications representative for Novaterra Environmental Solutions. He said he understood I had recently inherited a property in Cape Breton and that the company would be very interested in discussing a fair purchase offer, given the property's proximity to their remediation zone. He used the word opportunity 4 times in 3 minutes. I told him I would think about it and that he should feel free to call back. Then I hung up and wrote down everything he had said, word for word, from memory. 31 years of teaching children to listen carefully turns out to be useful for more than report cards. That evening, I called my son-in-law's older brother, François Beausoleil, who worked as a producer for a national French-language public radio program based in Montreal. I had not spoken to François since Thomas's funeral. He picked up on the second ring, and when I said Renee's name, he went quiet in a way that meant he had been waiting for this call. "I have documents," I told him. "I have lab records, correspondence, a formal research report, and a draft federal complaint. I have the name of a university scientist who can verify the methodology. And I have a note left on my car this morning that I believe constitutes intimidation of a witness." François was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "How soon can you get to Montreal?" "I'm not leaving the property yet," I said, "but I can send you everything digitally tonight, encrypted. Sylvie will tell me how." He exhaled slowly. "You know this will be loud, Margaret. Once we air this, there is no walking it back." "My daughter didn't build this in secret for 4 years so that it could be walked back," I said. The story aired 6 weeks later, in 2 parts, on François' program and simultaneously on its English-language partner network. The title was straightforward, Contaminated Silence, how 5 Mi'kmaq communities were left to drink poisoned water while a provincial ministry looked the other way. The research credit read, Primary data compiled by Dr. René Ouellet Beausoleil and Thomas Beausoleil, 2020-2024. I sat at the kitchen table in Thunder Bay and listened to the broadcast on my radio. Renee's name and my daughter's own careful research read aloud into 100,000 homes. I pressed my hand flat against the table and breathed. What followed was not quiet. Novaterra's communications team issued a statement calling the data selectively presented and the methodology unverified. Their legal department sent letters to the network, to Cape Breton University, and to me personally. The Provincial Ministry of Environment announced it would conduct its own review, which environmental advocates immediately called a conflict of interest. But community leaders from all 5 First Nations gave interviews. Parents of affected children shared medical records and spoke on camera. A former Novaterra contractor, a man named Ron Chisholm, who had worked the Prevost site during the original remediation, came forward with his own documentation records he said he had kept for years because he had never been comfortable with what he'd been asked to sign off on. The federal Environment and Climate Change Minister announced an independent tribunal within 10 days of the second broadcast. I want to tell you about the moment I understood what had to come next, because it matters to how the rest of this happened. 2 weeks after the broadcasts, I received a call from a woman named Brenda Gugu, a community health coordinator from Wacoba. She had a daughter, she told me 9 years old, named Clara, who had been experiencing tremors and attention difficulties for 3 years. Every specialist they had seen had called it idiopathic, untraceable. She had read the transcript of the radio program 3 times. She was calling, she said, simply to say thank you, that someone had finally said out loud what they had been living with in silence. I thought about that word, idiopathic, of unknown cause, the medical vocabulary of a system that could not or would not look hard enough. I thought about Renee, who had looked hard enough. For 4 years, alone in a lab on a windy stretch of the Cabot Trail with a mold excuse and a locked door and a daughter who didn't understand yet. I called Sylvie that afternoon and told her I wanted to attend the first federal tribunal session in person. "You're not a scientific witness," she said carefully. "No," I said, "but I'm the person who found the evidence. And I'm a 64-year-old retired schoolteacher from Thunder Bay, and when I walk into that room, every person at that table is going to understand that this information survived because Renee made sure it would." Sylvie was quiet. Then she said, "I'll book you a flight to Ottawa. There is a particular kind of man who runs a company like Novaterra. He had been the CEO for 9 years, a man named Gerald Fitzwilliam, early 60s, the kind of polish that comes from never having been genuinely challenged. He arrived at the tribunal in a suit that cost more than my monthly pension. I was already seated in the public gallery. When the tribunal chair presented Renee's compiled data, 4 years of sampling records from an independent lab, cross-verified by a university team, compared directly against the ministry's own filed reports, Fitzwilliam's legal counsel tried 3 separate procedural challenges to have the evidence set aside. All 3 were declined. I watched him. He had the look of someone accustomed to rooms going his way. They don't always go his way. After the morning session, I was approached in the hallway by a younger man from Novaterra's team, not a lawyer, a different kind of smooth. He said, in a voice calibrated to sound like a reasonable conversation, that the company remained open to discussing compensation arrangements with affected individuals and that a protracted public process would be difficult for everyone involved, including grieving families. I looked at him for a moment. "My daughter died 4 months after Novaterra sent her a legal threat telling her to stop testing water," I said. "The RCMP has not closed the accident investigation. I would choose your next sentences very carefully." He left. The federal tribunal delivered its preliminary findings 8 weeks later. The Prevost site had never been fully remediated. Novaterra had submitted falsified decontamination reports to the provincial ministry for 11 consecutive years. 3 ministry officials had known. Gerald Fitzwilliam was referred to the RCMP for criminal investigation. The province was ordered to fund emergency water infrastructure for all 5 communities within 18 months. An independent health assessment for all residents was mandated and fully funded. The RCMP reopened the investigation into the accident on the Trans-Canada. What they found ice on the road that had been reported to highway maintenance crews 4 days earlier without action, and a transport truck with a maintenance file that raised questions about brake performance was not conclusive proof of deliberate harm. It may never be. That is the hardest part of this to carry, and I carry it every day. But the work that Renee and Thomas built is not in question. It is a matter of federal record now. Their names are on it. That spring, I drove back to the Cabot Trail. The property was no longer a secret, and I no longer wanted to sell it. Sylvie helped me apply to convert it into a registered community environmental monitoring station in partnership with Cape Breton University and the 5 Mi'kmaq communities. The application was approved in June. We named it the Beausoleil Oulé Environmental Trust. I was there the day they put the sign up. Sylvie stood beside me. Daniel took a photograph. From the north-facing windows, we could see the Gulf spread out wide and gray-blue and indifferent to all of it. The same water that had been there before any of us arrived and would be there long after. Clara from Wacoba came with her mother for the opening. She was wearing a pink jacket and she had brought me a card she had made herself, a drawing of a woman with gray hair standing in front of a house with big windows. Underneath she had written, in careful 9-year-old printing, "Thank you for not going home." I have it on my wall in Thunder Bay. I still talk to Renee, the way you do when grief has settled into something quieter than agony but deeper than ordinary sadness. I tell her about the trust, about the sampling reports that come in now every quarter, verified and published, untouchable. About Clara, about the way the spruce trees look in October when the light goes gold and horizontal over the water. I used to think that keeping secrets was a kind of betrayal. I understand now that it is sometimes the most exhausting form of protection, that people who love you will sometimes build walls around you and accept the cost of your confusion rather than hand you a danger they're not sure you can survive. I could have survived it. I'm tougher than Renee knew, but I think she knew that too. I think that's why she left me the key. People ask me sometimes what I would have done if I had simply sold the property without going inside, if I had accepted the grief without following the questions. I tell them honestly that I almost did. I sat with that key on my kitchen counter for 11 days, and there were moments in those 11 days when the path of least resistance was very visible and very tempting. Grief is heavy. Unanswered questions are heavier. And I am 64 years old, and I had roses to tend, and a lakeshore to walk, and a life that was small and quiet and not uncomfortable. But Renee had written, "You'll understand," on a piece of masking tape and attached it to a brass key and trusted me with it. And I had spent 31 years in a classroom teaching children that language matters, that the words people choose, especially when they don't have many left, mean exactly what they say. You'll understand. She was right. I do. If there is anything I have learned from the last year of my life, it is this. The people we love sometimes carry burdens in secret, not because they think we're weak, but because they love us too much to watch us carry what they're carrying. Honor that love by being braver than they thought you could be. The key they leave you is never just about a door. It is about whether you trust them enough to open it. Justice, I have found, rarely announces itself. It does not arrive with fanfare or with the dramatic satisfaction of a movie ending. It arrives in a federal tribunal report filed on a Tuesday. It arrives in a phone call from a mother whose daughter has a name for what was making her sick. It arrives in a 9-year-old's drawing on your kitchen wall. It is quiet and it is slow and it is real. Do not let anyone tell you that one person, one retired teacher, one grieving mother, one ordinary woman who still prints out paper maps because GPS makes her nervous on unfamiliar roads cannot change the shape of what happens next. You can. The only requirement is that when you find the key, you use it. If this story stayed with you, please share it with someone who needs to hear it. And tell me, what would you have done if you found that letter? Because sometimes the bravest thing is not knowing what comes next and going anyway.